Hey everybody, this is Vegan Theology with Kevin and Sarah Hale, episode 50.
50.
Wow.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. It means a lot to us that you join us. And thank you for being here, Kevin.
Yeah,
Joining me at the
it's
table.
early.
We are so excited. We're discussing the conclusion and the appendix to Animals and World Religions by Dr. Lisa Kemmerer. The conclusion and appendix are so powerful. We were talking last night. The whole book has had a real impact on both of us.
Yeah.
It has changed us in significant ways.
Right.
Her voice or the tone of the writing changes, in my opinion, when we get to the conclusion and the appendix. Up until now, her voice has been very just one of description. Let me describe for you what the core teachings of Hinduism is, or what the moral exemplars of Buddhism say, or what the sacred texts of Judaism has to say about our relationship, God's relationship with creation, specifically animals. So it's been very descriptive and really informative, but the tone, the voice changes once we get to the conclusion in the appendix. There's so much forcefulness in a really good way. There's so much power in her voice. She's like, okay, given what we know, given what has been established in the previous several chapters, what are the only conclusions we have to come to?
Yeah.
Like, let's get honest. Let's get real.
Right.
So more than any of the other chapters, I feel inadequate to the task of really, it's like when you read really good fiction and then somebody says to you, explain to me why this is good fiction. And you realize that by describing it, you're going to be watering it down and
Right.
you're going to be breaking the spell that the author can put you under.
Right.
If you just allow the words themselves to wash over you.
Right.
One of our listeners reached out to us yesterday and said that she just purchased her own copy of this book. And that made me so happy because while there's value to what we're doing, for sure, especially for us, every time we read it and then we discuss it and then I edit it. And I feel like with each iteration, it gets deeper into my bones. And there's value to us discussing it, but I feel like to really get the full impact of what Lisa has to offer the world, you should read it for yourselves.
Yeah. It's been an amazing book.
Let's go through the conclusion and then we'll tackle the powerful appendix as well today. Keeping in mind, we've been through indigenous traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. By way of conclusion, what might be said about religions, human morality, and non-humans? She mentions that faiths that have a creator teach human beings that the divine is personally invested in the life of every animal. And she points out that, interestingly, consistent with Darwin, the world's dominant religions teach people that there is much more continuity than separation across species. This book focuses on aspects of religious traditions that protect and value animals because religions are overall radically friendly toward animals.
Yeah.
People tend to be ignorant of these prevalent teachings. And our current economic choices, bolstered by our collective spiritual ignorance, perpetuate animal industries that profit from untold miseries and billions of premature deaths. The religions themselves are radically animal-friendly.
Right.
But the people who follow these religions tend to be ignorant of that fact.
Right.
And our ignorance perpetuates the violence.
Yeah. I love that right there where she says religions overall are radically friendly towards animals.
And she talks about how when you start a conversation with a religious person, lots of times they argue that God doesn't care about animals, that it's fine to abuse and exploit animals. She says people who identify with a given religious tradition often use sacred writings to defend personal habits, but such arguments tend to be both shallow and specific, contradicting core and foundational teachings. Those who pose such arguments when questioned often agree readily that their religion does not teach or tolerate cruel exploitation, particularly when such cruel exploitation is entirely unnecessary. So if you were to press a religious person and say, does your religion teach you to be cruel, or does your religion tolerate exploitation?
Right.
People would be pressed to say, well, no.
I was thinking about this. I've really been focusing on this point about this conclusion. The argument's going to be, well, animals are different than humans.
Yeah.
Right. And I've kind of been going back and listening to our episodes on Lindsay's animal theology, where he makes the point when he wrote his animal rights books, he was using sentience as a way to determine the rights of animals. And at some point, another scholar gave him some feedback that, hey, actually, it's not about sentience. It's about the sacred text and what does God think? What's God's position on these animals? And I was thinking here too, well, what do the sacred texts say? The way I think philosophically, just with a little bit of philosophy I've had, some of the influence of Dr. Doug Kennard on me is he would speak about what he'd call modern foundationalism, building up this structure, building up these arguments that rest upon each other, this somewhat of a foundation. And to me, the more you can put on that, the better your argument. Back to Rillera, he's like, all you need is Genesis 1 and Isaiah 11. You don't need anything else. And I'm like, well, yeah, but wouldn't it be better if we added more stuff to it? I don't know. It just got me thinking, yeah, we can make all kinds of arguments, philosophical arguments, but what's God's position? Are we adherents to the religion that we claim we are? And if we are, well, then what does the sacred text and what does the actual creator think about it? And what I got from Lindsay, that should be all you need. And it's kind of what Rillera said as well, right? When Rillera first said it, I was like, eh. But the more I think about it, the more it sinks in. I'm like, actually, maybe he was right. You know, it's the same as what Lindsay's saying. All you need is, are you a believer in this God? Oh, you are? And you believe in his text? Okay, well, what does he think?
Yeah.
Well, here you go. That's really all you need.
Yeah. The arguments for animal exploitation, or that God is fine with animal exploitation, they tend to be very shallow and very specific. Whereas the core, the whole opus of what we know about God is that God is endless, boundless, abundant love, compassion, non-violence, and standing up for the powerless, standing against the abuser.
And with that, the demarcation we like to make, that I think we like to remind Christians, and again, we're still developing this, is there's what God intended in a perfect world and what will happen at the end of the age in the eternal state, which will be a perfect world. And then there's everything from the fall and before we get there. The way things are happening now are different than the way they were intended and the way that they will end. People are like, well, this is just the way life is. This may be the way it is, but it's not the way it's intended to be, and it's not the way it will be.
Along those lines, she says, religious people tend to be unaware that chewing on a chicken's body purchased at a grocery store contradicts the core religious ideals of every major religious tradition. She has a quote here from Gandhi, which I underlined. The soul of religions is one, but encased in a multitude of forms. We will, at some point, discuss our developing Christian universalism in our theology. I was actually talking with our pastor about his Christian universalism. And one thing he said was Christian universalism maybe isn't in vogue in the last century of evangelicalism, but it's nothing new. The first century of Christianity was very universalist. And this book has, in its own unique way, which isn't the purpose of her book, I don't think she's putting forth some kind of universalism. But it does illuminate this idea that God has been reaching out to creation. God has been reaching out for relationship with humankind and with non-human animals since the beginning of time, in all places, in all times. And to me, that resonates with the theology that we're building.
And similarly, what Lindsay was saying, that Christ died for all flesh.
Yeah.
Because, some Christians love to validate, are you saved or not? You just say these words. How can animals say those words for some fundamentalist preacher, right? And so Is God going to save those? Well, it sure sounds like he is. If God is going to save the animals without them confessing their belief in Jesus, then to me that does speak to some level of universalism.
She comes back to what she suggests are three logical options for religious people. When religious adherents understand contemporary animal industries and the values and morals that are central to sacred texts, they are faced with critical life-defining decisions. I have identified three possible reactions. She says you can either have a response of denial, a response of welfarism, or the response of liberationist or abolitionist. It's interesting to lay it out in black and white like this.
Right.
And I would say that by and large, most religious people who are not vegan are in the position of denial, right?
Yeah.
So some people simply reaffirm the status quo. They believe, in spite of overwhelming evidence to the contrary, that all is well in feedlots and slaughterhouses, chicken sheds, farrowing crates, laboratories, circuses, and zoos, and that contemporary animal industry practices are therefore religiously acceptable.
That does remind me. I remember speaking with a woman who's conservative and a believer, and I was explaining some of what's happening in some of these factory farms, and she was like, no, that doesn't happen here in the United States. I'm like, yeah, it does. And she kind of has her own little sanctuary for her horses and dogs, the animals that she cares about. And she just literally talked about denial. Like, no, that just would never happen in the United States.
Yeah.
I'm like, no.
Yeah.
Open your eyes. Like this is for real. So
if there's anywhere in the world where profit is king and dollars matter more than anything, then animal exploitation is certainly going to happen in America. So a position of denial. Don't know, don't want to know, everything's fine.
And that is today in our lives when we talk to certain people, Christians, they basically say they don't want to know.
Yeah.
They're not interested in knowing the truth about this. Admittedly, they'd rather live in ignorance.
Mm-hmm. How moral is that?
Right. Yeah, but they literally choose it and admit to choosing it.
Yeah. So that's a choice. The welfarist choice is more, okay, you've convinced me that this is cruel. The way we're doing it is cruel. What we're doing is fine. The way we're doing it is not fine. So let's just fix it and make it more humane. Let's reduce some suffering.
Right.
And she makes the point here that if that's your position, you have to stop supporting current animal industries until, while you wait for things to become acceptable.
Yeah.
So if you're a welfarist who says, yeah, you're right, factory farming is horrible, we could do it better.
Right.
Well, in the meantime, until we really start doing it, quote unquote, better, you have to stop supporting the current regime. And then the final option is complete liberationist. We should not be using animals in any way. We should not be keeping them in captivity. We should not be harassing them. We should not be abusing them. We should not be terrorizing them. And we should not be killing them. You can be ignorant of the evil being done, and you can be ignorant of what your religion actually says. But when you get rid of those ignorances, when you're willing to open your eyes and see the evil, the cruelty, and see what your religion actually says about it, then you have to make a choice. And it's either to go vegan, to live vegan, or decide that you don't really care about your religion.
Right. Yeah, and I think when you are willing to face facts and start to acknowledge what's happening and try to live an ethical life, your life does become more complicated. And maybe you're a Debbie Downer to some people, right? You're no fun. And
I'm always wondering, how did Jesus, who has God's perspective on everything, do such a beautiful job of being able to just fellowship with people and meet them where they are and see the goodness within them.
Right.
And so much that some people were so attracted to him and wanted to be around him.
Right.
How can we be that way?
And he would challenge them just enough, right?
Yeah, every person was different. He approached every person differently. Sometimes he was really, really harsh, right?
Right.
Sometimes he was so gentle. I believe because of Jesus's example that we can maintain deep, connected, loving relationships, even in the midst of an awareness that we have that we feel like some people haven't arrived at.
Right.
And also knowing that we have blind spots still.
I was just going to say that. We have blind spots. We don't know what they are, but...
We don't know what they are. Please don't tell us. Please do. Navigating is hard.
Yeah, it's real life.
It is real life. And she goes on to say, okay, then why do most religious people denounce animal liberationists, complaining that these courageous activists who break laws, even destroying property, why do so many Christians, Buddhists, etc., assume that such activists ought to be harshly punished and imprisoned for long periods of time as if they were dangerous terrorists?
I love this section. This speaks to me right here, this bit.
She goes into the fact that contemporary Western laws tend to support industry over life. In contrast, most human beings, whether religious or not, recognize that life is more important than profits. But that is not the system that we are in. Profits are more important than lives in the system that we are in so often. Animal liberationists who release fox or chinchillas from fur farms, free veal calves from chains and abysmal crates, destroy transport trucks that haul terrified turkeys and sheep to their premature deaths, burn slaughterhouses that dismember pigs and chickens, or destroy computers and research facilities are not dangerous terrorists. Animal liberationists simply believe that life is precious and that an industry designed to manipulate and destroy life for the sake of profits is ethically and spiritually unacceptable.
Yeah.
They do not target the lives of random citizens or the lives of any citizens. Animal liberationists do not target life. They target industries and profits that flourish at the expense of life. And they attempt to rescue the exploited. Terrorists kill randomly. Animal liberationists have never killed anyone. Animal liberationists exemplify what it is to live into the core teachings of every major religion concerning rightful relations between humans and animals.
That's powerful. And from our tradition, I mean, that's the essence of the gospel right there. Set the captives free.
Christians can be lulled into believing that to be a good Christian means to be a good citizen, to abide by the laws, to not cause waves, to not cause disorderly conduct, to not be out there protesting in the streets, to just be quiet and be nice and just go along.
Right. It's funny you say that. I was just reading something yesterday. I love Noam Chomsky, and there was some quote about corporations can do this due to manufactured consent, that there is this propaganda machine. There is this law and order mentality. And for Christians, somebody, not us, but somebody attaches all these things together, that when we say cleanliness is next to godliness, compliance is next to godliness. The moment you are disruptive, you are being ungodly. Mm-hmm. That's a fact in our country.
That ends up being our perception. That ends up being our modus operandi. People pull out that verse in one of the epistles by Paul that we need to be subject to authorities placed over us.
Romans 13.
Right. Even though there's so much in Scripture where God demands that we break laws.
100%.
We were even watching something last night and I'd never thought about it before. When Samuel goes to anoint King David, he is committing treason against the current king of Israel, which could easily cost him his life.
Absolutely, yeah.
So that's just one tiny example, but there's so many examples where we are called to go against an evil government.
Well, I think of Jesus in the Money Changers. He came in and just disrupted this whole exploitative scheme that was happening in the temple, in the outer court.
And rescued innocent animals.
Right.
Yeah. She starts talking about the numbers and extent of suffering and premature death are so extreme as to require mention. For example, the combined total of gypsies, Jews, and homosexuals killed in Auschwitz does not even approach numbers killed just in the food industry in just one day, just in the United States. I remember a time where Kevin said in Sunday school that the Holocaust of the animals is worse than the Holocaust of the Jews. And that did not go over well.
Right.
That did not go over well. But this is what I think you were getting at.
Right.
In terms of amount of suffering and in terms of numbers of souls affected by just the food industry,
Right.
the total number of people killed by the Third Reich doesn't even approach how many animals we kill in one day. The number of individuals enslaved and slaughtered on factory farms every year exponentially surpasses by trillions any form of exploitation of human beings anywhere at any time. According to recently published data from the U.S. Department of Agriculture and several other official sources, 59 billion animals died to feed Americans in 2009. American meat eaters were responsible for about 198 deaths per person in 2009, which accumulates to about 15,000 animals in the course of one individual's lifetime. And she talks about irrelevance, and this has been something that has been haunting me for a while now. In our episode where we talked about things that Akbar Ali was saying in terms of the silence from vegan activist communities on the genocide occurring in Gaza, he was saying, you have rendered yourself completely irrelevant. If you don't have anything to say about this, then you have no moral authority. And I was thinking, if that's true of vegan activist groups, how much more true is it of the church? When it seems like so often with so many social justice issues, the church is sometimes the very last institution to get on board.
Right. And that's also when I say we've abdicated our responsibility as stewards. That's exactly what I'm saying. When the secular powers, when the governments are making these decisions and we're agreeing or disagreeing or debating it and coming on at the end, or some of us are, I'm like, what is going on? That's our responsibility. We should be leading this.
Yeah. That's the sense I had even with little notes I made in her section that we just covered on animal liberationists, who the government calls domestic terrorists.
Right.
These people are driven by their compassion, willing to risk their lives, their livelihoods, their freedom, their financial. And I was thinking, shouldn't Christians be more compassionate than anybody? When we see suffering, shouldn't we be leading the charge?
Yeah, 100%.
I'd like to read some of what she says about this. When fighting racism in America, Martin Luther King Jr. commented, quote, "In the midst of blatant injustices, I have watched churchmen stand on the sideline and mouth pious irrelevancies and sanctimonious trivialities. Religious leaders have been more cautious than courageous and have remained silent behind the anesthetizing security of stained glass windows. Organized religion too often extends a weak and ineffectual voice with an uncertain sound. So often it is an arch defender of the status quo." What does it mean when core religious teachings do not determine how we live? Of what moral relevance are contemporary religious organizations if they have nothing to say about the most egregious sufferings ever, both in quality and quantity?
Yeah.
And she emphasizes the problem isn't the religion.
Right.
The truth and the beauty and the love and the compassion and the justice and everything we need is in the religion. It's there. The problem isn't the religion. The problem is the people. Our complicity is not the fault of religious teachings, but of humanity. Whatever we may say about compassion, service to the needy, respect for the natural world, humility, and other core religious commitments, what we do speaks unerringly. What we buy in local markets and grocery stores has either caused tremendous suffering and exploitation or it has not. What we serve for lunch is either linked with unnecessary suffering and pubescent death or it is not. Our choice of clothing, food, and entertainment either complies with core religious teachings or it does not. Saying a prayer before you kill an animal is no more acceptable than saying a prayer before you rape.
Wow.
In our day-to-day lives, we too often act without thinking, behave without conviction, and live without thoughtful intent. Our religious lives, including those of our spiritual leaders, too often take a back seat to selfish desire, convention, habit, and convenience. And she ends the conclusion with this statement, personally, my faith in religions has been affirmed in the course of this study, and I hope that those who stand behind the world's great religions will begin to commit to core religious teachings that require human beings to protect and assist animals. The world's great religions have tremendous potential to transform individuals and societies and to fight injustice and alleviate suffering, but religions are ultimately only as powerful as the people they inspire.
Wow.
Now, for her powerful and necessary appendix.
Yeah, she should publish just this appendix, maybe in a separate volume. But I'm sure for her as an author, she probably wants it at the end of this, but it's powerful.
The majority of the book is spent saying, let's dispel the ignorance around what religions actually say about how we should treat creation and animals. So we've dispelled that ignorance, and now we're going to dispel the ignorance around what actually happens to animals, what we're actually doing to animals, so that people can no longer claim ignorance.
Right.
And she's only going to focus in this appendix on what happens to animals within the food industry. In terms of scale, it's the first thing that needs to be addressed. Many people believe that animals are generally well cared for in animal industries, that laws protect sentient beings, and that it is in a rancher's or farmer's best interest to provide good care to those whom they exploit. Furthermore, many people believe that consuming dairy products and eggs is preferable to eating flesh. All of these assumptions are incorrect. This appendix focuses on farmed animals and fishing with special attention to laying hens and dairy cows.
No federal laws regulate the treatment of animals who are raised for flesh, eggs, or dairy products. And almost all customary animal agriculture practices, no matter how painful, are exempt from animal cruelty statutes. The most basic interests of animals take a backseat to economic interests of human beings. Animals are not individuals on factory farms. They are units of production, quote unquote, livestock. The cost of veterinary care, the cost of housing, and the cost of feed are all weighed against profits. As with any other industry, profits are the guiding principle.
It's sobering. Once somebody says that out loud, it's like, yeah, that makes perfect sense. That is the formula. That is the equation that any rancher, any farmer is up against. That they consider the cost of veterinary care, the cost of housing, the cost of feed, all of the costs are weighed against profits. As with any industry, profits are the guiding principle, not what's best for the animals, not what's most humane.
And that also reminds me when animal activists disrupt this capitalist machine, they're considered terrorists because they're disrupting the main driving economic force of our country. You know, many times I've said that the law enforcement, especially federal law enforcement, I refer to them as stormtroopers of the state, because they're not here for our protection. They're here to protect the interests of the state. That's all they're here for. And they can decide if they want to help you, the individual, but they don't have to. They're under no special obligation to help individual people. They're here to protect the interests of the state. And that's it.
We touched a nerve there. we got him going.
Easy.
And here she pauses to say, basically she's saying in my mind, I'm going to lay this out in black and white for you in the written word, but if you would please stop and look at undercover footage from these industries, if you would just watch, because nothing is more powerful in dismantling our blindness than actually looking at it, what's happening to animals as they're being abused. And it's hard to watch. It's very upsetting, but she really encourages people to take the courageous step of exposing themselves to that. So moving into the first category, which is cattle, specifically dairy cattle and the veal industry, she starts out, cows, like humans and other mammals, lactate only after they have given birth. In order to produce milk, cows must be repeatedly, forcibly, artificially impregnated. And each time they are impregnated, cows carry their young for 10 months, but their calves are stolen shortly after birth, though they try desperately to defend and protect their young. Cows, like most mammals, have a strong mothering instinct, but how can they protect newborns against exploitative human oppressors? They invariably lose their babies and then bawl for days.
The motherless calves are then sold for veal. The veal industry exists because many people buy yogurt and ice cream, cheese, and milk. The veal industry was created to take advantage of an abundant supply of calves who are merely byproducts of the dairy industry. Dairy calves are either killed shortly after birth and sold as bob, veal for low-quality dishes, like frozen TV dinners, or they are chained by the neck in a 2x5-foot wooden crate where they are unable to turn and where they can neither stretch nor lie down comfortably. While we drink their mother's milk, these miserable little beings are being given a milk substitute that is deficient in iron and fiber. This creates an anemic, light-colored flesh that is prized by those who purchase veal. These unfortunate calves are usually slaughtered when they are 4 months old. The veal industry confines and kills 1 million calves every year.
So when you buy dairy, you are supporting the veal industry.
This sounds horrible if you think about it from the calf's perspective.
Or the mother's
Or the
perspective.
mother's perspective, yes, the animal's perspective. Yeah, what a life. It's a brutal, horrific life. You're born and then you're just tortured.
You're dependent on humans to be humane.
Right.
And yeah, it's upsetting for sure.
Yeah.
And then, of course, some of the female babies who are born because of the industry are just put right into the dairy industry, and their tails are docked, which cuts through flesh, vertebrae, and tendons. And workers use smoking iron to burn out their nascent horns, searing through flesh and bone and leaving behind molten, bloody cavities. Despite their mouths being bound, the calves bellowed, wheezed, frothed, and strained. When they are old enough to be impregnated to bear young, only to have both their calf and their milk stolen, they endure mechanized milking for 10 out of 12 months per year, including 7 months of their 9-month pregnancies. They're being milked. To be milked, cows are herded into a milking parlor with the help of electrified gates, which presumably keep the herd moving, but which only shock the cattle who are at the back of the herd. These unfortunate cows are perpetually shocked when they become trapped behind other cattle in clogged passageways. Once in the parlor, a name that elicits both images of soft chairs and tea and books, a cow is locked into place via metal bars on each side of her neck. Milking machines are roughly and hurriedly attached to the cow's teats, and she stands there while her nursing milk, which she generates to feed her calf, is extracted. This process is repeated 2 or 3 times each day. Genetic manipulation and dietary controls cause extraordinary and unnatural milk output, 50 pounds of milk per day. Cows naturally produce just over 2 tons of milk per year, but recombinant bovine growth hormone and recombinant bovine somatotropin, synthetic human-created hormones, have increased milk flow so that cows now provide as much as 30 tons of milk annually, enough for 10 calves. In this unhealthy and unhappy existence, 1 in 5 factory farm dairy cows secretes pus from her udders, which invariably mixes with her milk.
Most cows who are shipped out from the dairy industry are pregnant when they are slaughtered. Cows are so exhausted by the dairy process that they are spent and sent to slaughter after just 4 or 5 years of repeated impregnation, birth, hormone doses, and machine milking. Those few cows who find their way to sanctuaries can live upward of 20 years. Dairy cattle are much older than cattle who are slaughtered to produce beef, so their flesh is considered low quality and is used for soup, burgers, or processed foods.
Many people become vegetarians to avoid supporting cruelty and premature death, but purchasing dairy products causes the slaughter of cattle just as surely as does eating a hamburger. When we buy the nursing milk of mother cows in our local supermarkets, we support the oppression and premature death of both cows and their calves. It is not financially feasible for dairy farms to keep millions of cattle who are too young to produce milk, who are males, or who can no longer continue to produce extraordinary quantities of nursing milk. People who avoid flesh for moral reasons must remember that dairy cows are invasively impregnated, their young are stolen, and for months afterward, their nursing milk is mined again and again because people buy dairy products. While most calves born into the dairy industry live a short but horrific life, mother cows endure exploitation year after year. People who are willing to adapt their diet to avoid supporting extreme cruelty and premature death must not shift to a vegetarian diet that increases consumption of dairy products. Will you read the last paragraph on dairy?
Dairy farmers control, manipulate, and capitalize on a cow's reproductive abilities, her nursing milk and her calf, and finally her flesh. To add insult to injury, the dairy industry has convinced consumers that cow's nursing milk is essential for good health. If milk is essential to human health, how have many people in China lived so long without dairy products and with much lower incidences of osteoporosis?
We've been lied to.
Yeah. Oh, 100%.
We lie to our children. We tell them that cows make milk for us, that's why God made cows, is to make milk for us, and that we need it to be fully healthy human beings.
Right.
It's all a marketing deception. Let's talk about the slaughter of cattle. 4 corporations slaughter more than 80% of the 35 million cattle who are killed annually in the United States. A standard slaughterhouse kills 250 cattle every hour, a rate at which it is impossible for workers to assure a quick or relatively painless death. In any event, killing cattle all day at high speeds does not create an attitude of caring or compassion. Hidden videos testify to the many animals who are hoisted onto the slaughter disassembly line, kicking, struggling, and fully conscious. An article in the Washington Post, April 2001, reported the experiences of one slaughterhouse employee and his friend Moreno. Quote, "The cattle were supposed to be dead before they got to Moreno, but too often they weren't. They blink, they make noises," he said softly. "The head moves, the eyes are wide and looking around." Still, Moreno would cut. On bad days, he says, dozens of animals reached his station clearly alive and conscious. Some would survive as far as the tail cutter, the belly ripper, the hide puller. "They die," said Moreno, "piece by piece." Legislation offers only minimal protection for animals sent to slaughter. Mammals are supposed to be, quote, stunned or rendered unconscious before they are killed. This is from the Humane Slaughter Act of 1958. But slaughter, like most contemporary businesses, is shaped and driven by economic factors. In the slaughterhouse, the quicker each animal is killed, the higher the profit margin. Time is money. Workers must be paid for their time. And while one animal's body is on the dismemberment line, no other body can be processed. Consequently, economics encourages speed, which works against effective stunning. Not surprisingly, a USDA survey concluded that stunning was either unacceptable or a serious problem in 36% of sheep and pig slaughterhouses and 64% of cattle slaughterhouses.
There are several slaughterhouse stunning methods: captive bolt pistol for cattle, most calves, and some sheep, electric stunner for pigs, most sheep, some calves, and though not required and not adequate to render the victims unconscious, an electrified water basin for birds. Although 90% of those killed in U.S. slaughterhouses are birds, chickens, turkeys, and ducks, poultry are exempt from the Humane Slaughter Act, and there are no federal humane regulations for poultry slaughter.
The electric stunner. When an animal enters the slaughterhouse, a worker clamps the electric stunner, imagine earphones, on an insulated handle onto the victim's head, and then triggers an electric shock. As with all high-speed assembly line operations, humans and mechanical errors are common, and many pigs, calves, and sheep emerge conscious and fully sentient. Making matters worse, there is currently no way to determine exactly how much electricity is required to properly stun a large pig or sheep versus a small pig or sheep, or any size in between. Insufficient current will paralyze the victim but not prevent sensation. Too much current will result in, quote, blown loins, bruising caused by capillaries that have burst. Blown loins reduce the value of flesh. So managers often lower the electric current, which means that many animals who are improperly stunned, especially larger animals, go to slaughter fully conscious and sentient, able to witness and feel everything that happens to them along the assembly line until at some point they perish.
A captive bolt pistol is placed against a cow's or a calf's forehead and then fired, driving a rod through the skull and into the brain. If done properly, the animal will immediately lose consciousness. However, poor aim, a hurried shot, or sudden movement from the cow will cause tremendous pain and damage, but will not stun the victim. Nonetheless, the assembly line keeps moving. Workers are pressured to process animals as quickly as possible. Consequently, improperly stunned animals are pushed forward, bellowing and struggling as they travel down the line, fully conscious, wounded, and frightened, to be disassembled. Undercover videos expose this sordid truth, and I literally just saw a video this week of this very thing where these slaughterhouse workers attempt to stun a cow. They use a captive bolt pistol, hit the cow in the head, and then the cow stands up, and then he or she is slipping or sliding on this bloody floor. And of course, the slaughterhouse workers have to corral this animal, and it's just...
You feel for...
It's horrific.
Hell on earth, these environments that people have to work in and that the animals are subjected to.
Well, it just seems dangerous. You're using all these tools and sharp objects, and there's blood all over the floor. It's probably very slippery, very unsafe. Mm-hmm. And where is OSHA?
Religious exemptions. In the United States, Jews and Muslims are exempt from, quote, humane stunning laws. Animals killed to provide kosher or halal flesh go to the knife fully conscious. While religiously sanctioned methods of slaughter were once an improvement over earlier methods, these religious techniques are now even more primitive and even more painful and frightening to the animal than our other contemporary slaughter methods. In Jewish slaughter, a cow's body is supported while the head is raised and extended to expose the jugular, which is then slit. The cow is supposed to die after a single cut. But the reality is very different, as undercover footage shows. One undercover investigator watched a slaughterhouse worker saw across a cow's throat 13 times while the cow struggled frantically for her life. Even when the cut is performed correctly, cattle are sometimes conscious for several minutes and are fully conscious and aware while they are hoisted onto an overhead rail to bleed out. Downers. Transporting animals to slaughter is a rough business. Like every aspect of the animal industries, transport methods are dictated by cost-benefit analysis. But what is cheapest is rarely best for animals or consumers. As a result, animals arrive at slaughter exhausted, thirsty, hungry, terrified. Many arrive injured, and some are unable to stand or walk. Slaughterhouse workers refer to arrivals who cannot or will not rise or move as, quote, downers. Every year, 100,000 factory farm cattle arrive at slaughter injured or too dispirited to walk. Undercover investigators have repeatedly documented downed animals being kicked, beaten, pushed with bulldozers, and dragged from transport trucks with ropes or chains. These animals are often fully conscious, in pain, and bellowing pitifully. In terms of cows raised for beef, she writes, motorists who see cattle grazing in wide open fields have no idea what cattle raised for the flesh industry have already suffered, how short their days of grazing, or what lies ahead for these doomed individuals. Cattle are bred to give birth early in the spring to suit a rancher's schedule. Consequently, some calves do not survive the spring cold. A few weeks after birth, beef cattle are marked and identified, their ears are cut or pierced, and or they are branded, which causes third-degree burns that ooze and fester. The males are castrated either by slicing off the testicles with a knife or by cutting off the blood supply with a rubber band, causing the testicles to eventually fall off. She writes, when I wander the prairies of Montana in the spring, I find little withered testicles among the sage, with a hardy rubber band still attached. Each of these invasive procedures is performed without anesthesia.
Calves are forcibly transported from vast, quiet grazing lands where they have lived in community since birth to a world of people, vehicles, and close confinement at roughly 7 months of age. Cattle are not watered or fed during transport, even across hundreds of sweltering miles, including overnights in which they remain standing in crowded trucks. Adolescent cattle destined for beef industry are delivered to feedlots, where they are crowded into manure-packed pens with as many as 10,000 other cattle. They are given growth-promoting hormones and unnaturally rich diets, causing them to double their weight in just a few months. They are assessed by the pound. Their lives end at the slaughterhouses.
Let's talk about pigs. Pigs are intelligent and social, in many ways similar to dogs. They are also very tidy. When pigs have sufficient space, they do not defecate in areas where they sleep or eat. More than 95% of today's pigs are factory farmed, spending their entire lives crowded in small, concrete, indoor pens. On factory farms, where a few extra feet of cage space reduces profit margins, pigs must live in their own feces, urine, vomit, even amid the corpses of other pigs, as discovered by many undercover agents.
100 million pigs are raised and slaughtered every year. Among these unfortunate pigs, breeding sows are the most unfortunate. Like cattle in the dairy industry, sows suffer a continuous cycle of artificial impregnation, controlled birth, forced nursing, and the stealing of their young. During 4 months of pregnancy, breeding sows are isolated in gestation crates, small metal pens just 2 feet wide, where they stand on cement floors. Lack of space prevents them from turning or even lying down comfortably, and the sides of larger sows perpetually rub on surrounding bars.
When it is time to give birth, sows are transferred to similarly cramped farrowing crates with concrete or metal floors and bars that prevent mothers from reaching their piglets while allowing the young to reach their mother's teats. Short chains or rubber straps are sometimes used to immobilize the mother, allowing for perpetual nursing in order to fatten the piglets for slaughter. This intense unlimited nursing frequently causes lacerations and painful infections on sows' udders, but they have no choice. They are unable to move. Normally, piglets nurse for about 15 weeks, but factory farm piglets are taken from their mothers at just 2 or 3 weeks of age. These piglets are weaned in crowded concrete nursery pens surrounded by metal bars, with little more than 1 square yard of floor space per pig. They are slaughtered at about 6 months of age, though pigs lucky enough to find a home in a sanctuary can easily live beyond 15 years.
5 days after her piglets have been taken, a sow is again forcibly, artificially impregnated. Sows endure at least 2 pregnancies, births, and nursing stints per year, generally giving birth to more than 20 piglets annually. When a sow is no longer considered productive after birthing 4 to 7 times, she is sent to slaughter, usually at about 4 years of age. As with cattle, the lucky ones are slaughtered young. Factory farm sows, who are repeatedly impregnated and perpetually confined, have weak bones and muscles, heart problems, and frequent urinary tract infections. The concrete that they stand on causes crippling leg disorders, which leads to arthritis, and a lack of exercise causes obesity, which farmers strive to create, breeding and feeding pigs so that they will grow as quickly as possible. Transgenic pigs have recently been bred to grow even faster. With barely enough room to stand or lie down and no bedding to speak of, many sows have chronic sores on their shoulders and knees. Respiratory diseases are also common. 70% of factory farm pigs suffer from pneumonia. Despite these common problems throughout the course of a year, 1 in 4 commercial pig operations never summon a veterinarian.
Deprivation, chronic pain, and frustration cause sows to adopt neurotic coping behaviors. Sows would normally build a nest of leaves or straw before giving birth. In their barren cells, sows repeatedly and desperately try to build a nest and often fall to moving their heads backward and forward pointlessly in a rhythmic fashion, gnawing on surrounding metal bars. Overcrowding and boredom also cause aggression, which is why pigs' tails are chopped off and their teeth cut at birth without anesthesia. Giving pigs more space would allow them to create nests, root, and wallow, normal pig behaviors, which would also prevent neurotic behaviors and aggression. But from an economic point of view, it is cheaper to dock tails and cut teeth than it is to provide pigs with adequate space. Pig psychosis does not affect a pig farmer's bottom line. As with all factory-farmed animals, pigs are not provided with food, water, or protection from extreme weather when they are transported to slaughter. Each year, 80,000 pigs die in transit. At the slaughterhouse, downer pigs are dragged from transport trucks. Survivors face questionable stunning methods before they are shackled and hoisted by their hind leg onto a belt that moves them to the blood pit, where the worker cuts the pig's throat, sometimes at the remarkable rate of 900 pigs per hour. Needless to say, at such speeds, throat slitting cannot be achieved with any precision. Undercover video shows conscious pigs moving along the processing line, kicking and struggling, hanging upside down by one leg, while workers try to stick the terrified victim. Sometimes the unfortunate pig remains conscious all the way to the scalding tank, where she or he is boiled alive. Sheep. Those who buy wool, like those who consume dairy products, often believe that they do not support death and misery. But wool, like cheese and ice cream, is linked with considerable suffering and routine premature death. Sheep are raised to produce wool for clothing and lambs for slaughter, but all sheep are ultimately slaughtered for the flesh industry at a comparatively young age. About 33% of U.S. sheep profits stem from wool. Most of the remaining profit comes from the slaughter of lambs. Sometimes skins and nursing milk are also sold. Genetic manipulation has produced sheep with excessive, unhealthy amounts of wool, such that skin folds are now routinely cut from sheep to avoid medical complications. Much wool sold in North America is imported from Australia or New Zealand, nations that permit tail docking, castration, and slicing off of skin folds. Each of these surgeries is performed without anesthesia. Shearing also causes bruises and cuts and brings traumatic and life-threatening change for sheep who suffer greatly when their woolly coat is suddenly removed. Some become ill and or die from exposure.
Left to their own devices, ewes give birth to 1 or 2 lambs in warm spring conditions. Lured by inflated Easter prices, farmers manipulate breeding cycles to bring lambs early into the world and early to slaughter. As a result, 20% of U.S. lambs die before they reach 2 months of age, usually from exposure. In the United States, as many as 100,000 sheep and lambs perish in the spring because they are ill-equipped to survive early spring weather. Survivors are slaughtered between the ages of 1 week and 6 months and marketed for religious feasts, especially Easter. How did the most important Christian holiday, celebration of eternal life through a loving Savior, become mired in bloodshed? How did Christians come to celebrate the resurrection of the Lamb of God with the slaughter of millions of God's defenseless lambs?
When a mother sheep's production declines, she is sent to slaughter, usually between 4 and 8 years of age, though sheep who are allowed to live out their natural lives can live up to and even beyond 15 years. Meat from these older sheep, mutton, who were first exploited for their reproductive abilities is considered less desirable and is used for processed foods. And then let's talk about poultry.
Poultry. Nearly 10 million chickens are hatched annually in the United States. More than 95% of U.S. hens are factory farmed. These hens are raised in giant warehouses where they live out their short lives in confinement and deprivation.
She begins with the laying hens, the hens who are in the egg industry. Factory farmers exploit 30 million laying hens each year. Shortly after hatching without anesthesia, female chicks are debeaked. The tips of their sensitive beaks are sliced off with a hot blade. This procedure is intended to reduce injuries caused by stressed birds in overcrowded conditions, but comes at a price. Debeaking causes many fragile little chicks to bleed to death or die of shock. Newly hatched chickens are considered expendable in the poultry industry.
When they are just 18 weeks old, 4 or more young hens are placed in crowded 1.5 square foot cages, slightly bigger than your average microwave oven, even though one hen's wingspan is roughly 2.5 feet. In these crowded conditions, their wings constantly rub against wire, causing featherless sore spots. Nonetheless, these cages are piled one on top of the other in giant sheds where the hens remain until they are sent to slaughter.
Hens lay eggs and cows produce milk as part of their basic biological functioning, and they do so in excessive quantities due to biological manipulation. Not because they are well cared for or contented. Even the most miserable human, if provided with adequate food, is likely to ovulate or pass eggs and lactate, produce milk after birth. Common sense tells us the same is true for chickens and cows. When hens ovulate, they feel a strong nesting urge, which they cannot satisfy in such cramped cages. Hens are forced to lay their eggs under their crowded feet on wire, and their eggs roll onto a conveyor belt to be taken away and boxed. Though each hen annually produces upward of 250 eggs, while their wild counterparts lay roughly 10 to 20 eggs per year, factory farmed hens are never permitted to build a nest, sit on their eggs, or tend their young, or even step out onto grass or feel the sunshine.
When a hen's egg production goes into a natural decline after a few months, they are put through forced molt, in which they are starved and kept in total darkness for as long as 18 days. This shocks the hens' exhausted bodies into yet another egg cycle, and simultaneously causes hens to lose a great deal of weight. Some lose more than 25% of their body weight, and 5 to 10% of the hens die during that time. All of the hens suffer terribly, but this cruel practice increases profits by immediately bringing on another cycle of ovulation. Hens who die during forced molt are considered no loss whatsoever to the industry because their egg production had already declined. And factory farmers will quickly rid themselves of such birds in any case.
Due to forced ovulation, factory-farmed hens sometimes suffer from cage layer fatigue, a condition in which they become egg-bound and die because they are too weak to expel yet one more egg. Factory-farmed hens also suffer from prolapse. The uterus is expelled along with the egg. Egg peritonitis and inflammation, cancers, severe liver and kidney disease, and infectious bronchitis caused by living in their own excrement. Because a tremendous amount of calcium is required to produce eggshells, hens commonly suffer from calcium deficiencies and often endure broken bones and paralysis.
Chickens at sanctuaries can live up to 15 years, but factory farm hens are destroyed roughly 1 year after they hatch. Egg-laying chickens are bred for egg production. They don't grow fast or large enough to bring a profit in the flesh market. So it is not cost-effective to send these birds to slaughter. Consequently, millions of spent hens are thrown into wood chippers alive. Undercover investigators documented Ward Egg Ranch in California, throwing more than 15,000 live spent laying hens into a wood chipping machine. Despite tremendous outcry from a newly informed and horrified public, the district attorney declined to prosecute, noting that disposing of live hens in a wood chipper is legal and is recognized as a common industry practice.
Roughly half of a hen's offspring are males. Like veal calves, male chicks are an expendable byproduct of poultry industries. 200 million newly hatched male chicks are discarded every year. These chicks are of no economic value to the egg industry or to the flesh industry because roosters are too aggressive to be kept in cramped factory farm conditions. These little fellows are gassed, crushed, or simply thrown into garbage bins where they dehydrate or asphyxiate, or they are tossed into a grinder or chipper like spent hens. Eyewitness accounts describe struggling, peeping chicks dismembered by metal blades. Their little fluffy bodies, when ground to oblivion, are sold as fertilizer or as feed for other farmed animals, even those who would naturally eat only grass and grains.
When laying hens are sent to slaughter, though they are just beyond adolescence, they are much older than broilers who are raised for flesh. The flesh of laying hens is therefore of lesser market value, and their spent bodies are shredded to create soups, baby foods, stock cubes, school dinners, pot pies, the restaurant trade, animal food, or other low-grade products.
Please know that we pay for extreme suffering if we purchase skim milk, omelets, peach yogurt, mozzarella cheese, egg salad sandwiches, and strawberry ice cream. Egg and dairy industries cause extreme prolonged suffering and massive premature death. One individual cannot shut down the entire industry, but every dollar spent on dairy and eggs is a vote in favor of these cruel industries. And then she goes into the broiler hens, the chickens used for meat.
More and more people are moving from red flesh to white flesh in the hope of staving off heart attacks, strokes, and cancer linked with the consumption of cow flesh. This change in demand has provided a considerable boost to the broiler industry.
Hens are exploited not only for their reproductive abilities, but also for their flesh. Hens in the broiler industry are crowded by the thousands into warehouses that hold up to 100,000 birds. Roosters are far too aggressive to live in these unbearably crowded conditions. Consequently, like hens who are exploited for their eggs, broilers are sexed and females are debeaked just after they hatch, while males are cast into a bin to suffocate or into a chopper where they are ground to bits. Chickens have natural sleep rhythms that are determined by daylight and darkness. Light deters hens from sleeping, which encourages them to eat, too much of which causes them to gain weight rapidly. Most of the windowless sheds that are typical for battery hens are therefore equipped with artificial lighting, which remains on for most of a 24-hour period, perpetually disturbing and manipulating the hens' sleep patterns.
Not only is light manipulated to fatten hens, but they are also given high-protein feed and growth-promoting antibiotics, and they are genetically altered so that they grow twice as fast and twice as large as their recent ancestors. Broiler hens reach 4 pounds slaughter weight in just 6 weeks, but their immature bones cannot possibly support such unnatural weight gain, and these hens live in chronic pain for the last weeks of their short lives. Factory farmed hens do not move much because it hurts, but those who are motivated by profit see this as a benefit. A hen who does not attempt to move about freely is likely to gain more weight.
Hens trapped in the broiler industry are handled with the expectation that their lives will be very short and significant losses are expected. Individual hens have very little market value. The floors of these giant, crowded sheds are quickly covered with excrement, creating lung-damaging air. Broilers stand and lie in their own heaped droppings, developing blisters, ulcers, and burns on their feet, legs, and breasts from their own nutrient-rich manure. Because hens in broiler sheds are confined in crowded, unsanitary conditions, thousands succumb to heat prostration, infectious diseases, and cancers. They also die frequently of heart failure because their hearts and lungs cannot sustain such fast and excessive growth.
Broiler hens reach market weight just 45 days after they hatch, at which time workers enter the dismal sheds grabbing the frightened, overweight birds by a wing, leg, or head, whatever they can grab, and cramming them into crates stacked on trucks. The terror-stricken plump birds with weak hearts and fragile bones dislocate and break hips, legs, and wings, hemorrhage internally, and suffer heart attacks as they try desperately to escape. The end, like their lives in general, is a testament to human cruelty and indifference.
As with other factory-farmed animals, it is cheaper to absorb high transportation mortality rates than to pay for enclosed transport trucks. Though they travel as much as 80 miles per hour in all weather conditions, hens travel in open cages or crates stacked on open trucks without food, water, or protection from rain, snow, or sun. Some birds inevitably freeze to death, while others die from heat stress or suffocation during their prolonged transport.
At the slaughterhouse, hens are dumped onto a conveyor belt, but some flapping and frightened birds inevitably miss the belt and fall onto the ground, where they are generally crushed by machinery, but also may die of starvation or exposure. Hens who land on the belt are quickly hung upside down by their legs in metal shackles. For the sake of efficiency, most slaughterhouses attempt to stun birds. It is much easier to kill a bird who is not struggling. As the birds move along the assembly line, hanging upside down, turning their heads to see what might befall them, their heads are supposed to touch an electrified basin of water. Some birds, particularly smaller ones, raise their heads to avoid the water and are therefore not stunned. Furthermore, even if they touch the water basin, the shock is likely of no help to the hens. Like the electric tongs used in cattle, the amount of current needed to properly stun birds is uncertain. As noted, U.S. laws do not regulate the slaughter of fowl, though 90% of the animals killed for food in the United States are birds. Too much electrical power damages the flesh, reducing profits, inclining managers to err on the side of too little electric current. As a result, birds are usually immobilized by the electric basin but remain fully sentient.
After they pass the electric water basin, a hen's throat is cut either by hand or with a mechanical blade. Slaughter lines run up to 8,400 chickens per hour. So accuracy is the exception rather than the rule. Foster Farms' Livingston plant in California kills nearly 600,000 chickens daily. After the throat-slitting procedure, whether successful or not, birds are submerged in scalding water with intent to loosen their feathers. Those whose throats were not slit or were not slit properly, millions annually, are boiled alive.
Roughly 1 million factory farm hens are killed each hour for human consumption. When adjusting one's diet on behalf of animals, please do not reject red flesh in preference for white flesh. Also, please do not buy eggs. Compassion does not permit us to become vegetarians who consume yet more dairy and eggs. Compassion must guide us away from poultry products in light of the sheer numbers of hens affected, in light of the intense suffering forced on hens and chicks, and because of their premature, unregulated demise. Compassion requires us to cut back on all animal products or eliminate animal products entirely.
She discusses turkeys next. 250 million turkeys are slaughtered for flesh each year. 45 million turkeys are killed each year for Thanksgiving alone. More than 250 million turkeys are hatched in the United States annually, though almost all of the males are quickly discarded. Most of the remaining turkeys are slaughtered after just 4 months when they reach market weight, though turkeys who live in sanctuaries can live up to 15 years.
Like chickens, factory farm turkeys are genetically manipulated. They are selectively bred for extremely large breasts so that neither their bone structure nor their internal organs can withstand such rapid, excessive growth. Consequently, millions of baby turkeys die prematurely from heart attacks, and many turkeys have problems standing upright. When they fall amid the grossly overcrowded flock, they are trampled. It is more profitable for factory farmers to absorb this loss of life than it is to allow turkeys to grow more proportionally or to send smaller turkeys to market. Losses caused by stress or trampling are easier to absorb than the cost of providing poultry with adequate space.
Male turkeys now grow so large that they cannot mount hens and therefore cannot reproduce naturally. Consequently, turkeys are artificially inseminated, known in the turkey industry as breaking the hens. To, quote, break a turkey, these large and cumbersome females are tipped upside down and injected with semen that has been stripped from males. Turkeys who are exploited for their semen or eggs continue to grow long after their peers have been shipped off to slaughter, reaching such massive weights as 25 pounds before they are worn out, at which time they are transported to slaughter in crowded open trucks for low-grade products like turkey ham and turkey sausages.
Geese and ducks. Like all factory farm animals, the lives of waterfowl are short and restricted, stressful, and monotonous. They are kept without bathing water in small, dirty cages that do not permit these unhappy prisoners to spread their wings. They often cannot even turn around.
The cruelty of exploitation is nowhere more evident than in the production of foie gras. Foie gras is created by force-feeding ducks and geese. To do this, employees shove a metal tube down the birds' throats and into their stomachs. This process is repeated 2 or 3 times each day. The metal tubes cause painful bruising, lacerations, sores, and can even rupture organs. This force feeding swells the livers of ducks and geese to reach a size that is 10 times that of a normal liver. Needless to say, this predicament, both the feeding and the condition, is extremely painful. Next, Dr. Kemmerer wants us to know we could be educated consumers and not be fooled by marketing ploys of the animal agriculture industry when they label things with these beautiful humane labels like free range, cruelty free, organic, natural foods.
Some people seek to avoid supporting the excessive cruelty of factory farms by purchasing products with special labels, but these labels do not satisfy even the most basic requirements of a compassionate consumer. Quote unquote free range, cruelty free, organic, and natural foods industries exploit farmed animals for flesh, nursing milk, and reproductive eggs almost exactly as they do other factory farms. Quote unquote organic labels protect farmed animals in only one meager way. Organic labels indicate that farmers feed only organic foods, no hormones, to their victims. Organic guidelines provide no further protections for farmed animals. Therefore, animals who are exploited for quote-unquote organic foods are raised, maintained, transported, and slaughtered just like their non-organic counterparts. They are debeaked, dehorned, detoed, castrated, and or branded, and they are kept, transported, and slaughtered in the same deplorable conditions.
Organic labels basically do nothing for the animals. In fact, it's been argued that organic labels actually make it even worse, especially for lactating cows. Their mastitis can't be treated with antibiotics,
Right.
and so they just suffer with their
Right.
infections. Natural products are not allowed to live in natural conditions. They are not even allowed to satisfy their most basic natural behaviors. Despite reasonable consumer assumptions about what natural means, the USDA's natural food labels regulate only the presence of artificial additives and the degree of processing.
Eggs and chicken flesh marketed as quote-unquote free range very rarely have more space than hens crowded into battery cages, and they may or may not be able to step outside. If they can step outside, their outdoor pen is likely tiny, crowded, and barren. It is simply not profitable to keep fewer hens on more land. It is profitable to keep a greater number of hens on less land. It is perfectly legal to keep 20,000 or more quote-unquote free-range hens in captivity such that each hen is allotted no more space than is encompassed in an average size sheet of paper, with little or no access to the outdoors. If the hens can go outside, the exit is very often small, allowing only the closest hens to get out. For those who might be able to access the small doorway that leads to the outside world, much touted quote-unquote free range may be nothing more than a mudyard saturated with manure. Mm-hmm. And there's a whole book by Hope Bohannon called The Humane Hoax, which is worth reading on this topic.
Humane washing. And
right.
Yes, it's very, very good.
Dr. Kemmerer has a section on environmental degradation, which talks about the negative impacts of factory farming on the environment. Roughly 60 million acres of agricultural land is devoted to growing grain, and 70% of our grain crop is consumed by animal agriculture. Farming animals requires 70% more cropland because we must grow 70% more grain in order to feed cattle, pigs, hens, and turkeys. We could feed about 20 times as many people if we used our agricultural land to grow grains and greens only for human consumption. Instead, we continue to destroy prairies, forests, and wetlands, the earth's purifiers, to grow grains to feed cattle, pigs, and chickens.
In addition to the extra 70% of croplands created to sustain animal industries, some 40% of United States lands, or about 800 million acres, are devoted directly to grazing farmed animals. More than 60% of these lands are overgrazed, causing billions of tons of soil loss annually. Cattle graze on open range lands, trample sensitive stream beds, contaminate water, and destroy the natural flora and fauna of the area. More plant species have been lost because of overgrazing than for any other reason. Public lands, mountains, and prairies that ought to be preserved for all of us to enjoy are rented to ranchers for a pittance as part of the government's generous meat industry subsidies.
The primary cause of tropical deforestation is converting forest to croplands and pastures. Between 1960 and 1990, while meat consumption was on the rise, 13% of the world's forests were destroyed. Currently, somewhere on this planet, a section of forest equal to 20 football fields is lost every minute. 12 million hectares of forest are cleared annually. 55 feet of tropical forest are destroyed for each quarter pound of flesh imported by the United States. Between 1990 and 2005, Brazil was the unfortunate world leader in both beef exports and deforestation. Brazil tripled beef production exports and lost a patch of trees roughly the size of California in the process.
We have now destroyed half of the world's rainforests, forests known to hold more than half of the world's life forms, including Brazil's critically endangered capuchin and little blue macaw, of which only a handful remain. At our current rate, pretty much all tropical forests will be gone by the year 2050, along with the many animals who depend on these forests for their survival.
Even if forests are not destroyed, such as in prairie lands, ecosystems and individuals within ecosystems are harmed by an influx of great herds of farmed animals. Ranchers graze cattle on lands that once supported a multitude of wild animals, great herds of bison, gazelle, deer, elk, and quagga. In South Africa, for example, ranchers drove the once abundant quagga from their plains and from the planet to secure grasslands for their cattle. If you could have gone your whole life without ever eating any part of a cow's body in order to secure the existence of the quagga, would you have done so? It is too late for the quagga, but not for other animals who are threatened by animal agriculture. We vote with our teeth.
The U.S. federal agency, euphemistically known as Wildlife Services, a branch previously and more aptly named Animal Damage Control, is in charge of resolving wildlife conflicts. More specifically, they protect American agriculture, including livestock such as cattle and sheep, usually by destroying any problematic animals. In this manner, millions of U.S. tax dollars are spent on predator control to protect the profits of animal industries. Wildlife Services perpetually poison, trap, and shoot coyotes, bears, mountain lions, bobcats, prairie dogs, skunks, and many other animals on behalf of rancher investments. In 2007, Wildlife Services killed 1.6 million animals for ranchers.
Methods used to kill these animals include shooting from helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft, trapping, poisoning, and denning, which is killing pups in their dens with a fumigant. Used extensively at the behest of ranchers in some western states, aerial gunning accounts for the greatest percentage of predator take by Wildlife Services. Trapping is used almost as much, generally in the form of leg-hold traps and neck snares, both of which can cause significant suffering to trapped animals. In addition, both types of traps routinely injure or kill non-target animals, such as deer, birds, and pets.
These are ugly, unnecessary deaths that manipulate and destroy natural ecosystems. Raising animals for flesh also contributes significantly to carbon dioxide, nitrous oxides, chlorofluorocarbons, and methane, global warming. In fact, animal agriculture causes more greenhouse gases than all transportation methods, automobiles, jets, and so on, combined. For example, 1 calorie of protein from feedlot beef requires about 78 calories of fossil fuels, while 1 calorie of protein from soybeans requires only about 2 calories of fossil fuels. For every 2 pounds of flesh, cattle produce roughly 1 pound of methane, a greenhouse gas that is 25 times as potent as carbon dioxide.
A diet based on animal agriculture also requires exponentially more water than does a plant-based diet. As noted, a diet based on animal products requires 70% more grain, much of which requires irrigation. Water is also necessary to clean dairies and slaughterhouses and to satisfy the water needs of large numbers of large animals. Producing 1 pound of cow's flesh requires 100 times more water than does the production of 1 pound of potatoes. Americans who consume animal products also unwittingly consume roughly 4,200 gallons of water on a daily basis. In contrast, a vegan diet requires only 300 gallons of water per day. In semi-arid regions like California, even more water is required. 1 pound of California beef requires roughly 5,200 gallons of water, whereas 1 pound of California vegetables requires only 25 gallons of water.
On land, manure releases ammonia that damages leaves and forests and the soil itself. But manure causes the most damage when it is washed from lands to seas. Factory farms generate 500 million tons of manure annually. Animal waste in the U.S. has reached 1.4 billion tons of wet manure per year, or 89,000 pounds per second, 130 times that produced by humans. But unlike cities that must treat their sewage before discharging it into the environment, CAFOs store their liquefied excrement in large dirt cesspits called lagoons, or in piles of solids called litter, and then spread the raw waste on surrounding cropland.
In the United States, animals and animal agriculture create 5 times as much water pollution as do human beings, and twice as much as they do other industries. Animal waste is stored in large slurries on many pig farms. These slurries sometimes leak or spill, carrying E. coli into the water system and causing massive fish kills and dangerous bacterial water contamination.
Animal agriculture also causes dead zones, areas of the ocean where oxygen levels are too low to support marine life. Dead zones develop in waters where phosphorus and nitrogen are abundant. Manure is rich in both. Phosphorus and nitrogen provide nutrients that create algae blooms, which create microscopic phytoplankton that sink to the bottom of the ocean, where they are eliminated by oxygen-consuming bacteria, which also consume the oxygen, leaving little of this vital element for oxygen-dependent sea creatures. Oxygen-starved sea life soon falls unconscious and then perishes. The magnitude of the devastation of the dead zone is huge. The environmental impacts of low oxygen levels in water or hypoxia include noxious algal blooms that choke out fish, shrimp, and crabs, altered coastal phytoplankton food webs, the lowest rung of the ocean food chain upon which most sea life depends, altered stream-side ecosystems, massive fish kills, altered migration patterns for species like shrimp, and loss of suitable habitat for the spawning of fish, shrimp, and crabs.
Dead zones are becoming both more numerous and more expansive. Animal agriculture in the United States has created a gigantic dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. Some 52% of U.S. farms are located along the Mississippi River, and waste from these farms drains into the Gulf of Mexico. The dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico is the largest in the world, affecting some 6,000 to 7,000 square miles. Nitrogen input has at least doubled from the Mississippi River basin, and in some places it has increased 7-fold in the past century. Human beings have also created dead zones in the Baltic Sea, Black Sea, Chesapeake Bay, off the coast of Oregon, the size of 300 square miles, even in Lake Erie. The UN Environment Program reported 146 dead zones caused by proliferation of nutrients in water, caused by a proliferation of manure from animal agriculture.
Lastly, she focuses in on the fishing industry. Sometimes people switch to chicken and fish when they learn of serious health problems associated with red meat. This change in diet results in more animal suffering and death because fish and chicken are smaller than cattle and pigs. More animals must be killed to provide the same amount of flesh. For example, one might feed a small village by killing a single cow, but one cannot even feed a large family with an average-sized chicken or salmon. As a result of increased fish consumption, a quarter of the world's commercially imported ocean fish populations are depleted. Another 47% are fished to the full extent of their capacity. The Atlantic salmon is commercially extinct, and the adult Atlantic cod population along Cape Cod is only 1.1% of what it was in the 1960s. And she goes on to list many other different fish species that are endangered. For every edible pound brought in by trawlers, they pull in 5 inedible pounds from the seas.
Wow.
1/4 of sea life captured by fishing industries is bycatch, destroyed for no purpose. The worst bycatch offender is the shrimp industry, which brings in 2% of edible sea life and 30% of the bycatch. We pull 80 to 100 million tons of marketable fish from the oceans, mostly herrings, cod, jacks, redfish, and mackerel. Like all vertebrates, fish have a central nervous system, including a brain, spinal cord, and nerves. Yet we inevitably deny or ignore their suffering. When deep-sea fish are brought to the surface, they suffer from decompression just as we would. Sometimes their organs burst. Billions of fish suffocate on boat decks. Suffocation is the standard slow death that awaits most individuals who've been pulled from the water by human hands. This, of course, has an effect on pelicans and fishers and bears, seals, larger fish who depend on what we're catching for their lives. For example, pollock, a fish commonly consumed by humans, is the main food source of the endangered stellar sea lion. Hundreds of young penguins were recently washed up onto Brazil's shores, most likely as a result of overfishing. With so many humans eating so many fish, how will other creatures find what they need to survive? 90% of big sea predators are now struggling to survive. Not only are others starving because we are consuming so many fish, they're also being shot so that we can consume fish. The Marine Mammal Protection Act was amended in 1994 to allow sea lions to be shot because they eat fish, our fish. In the same year, the Canadian government and the province of Nova Scotia also proposed killing thousands of seals to protect fishing interests.
That's crazy.
She writes, this year, 90,000 seals were clubbed to death in Namibia, including 85,000 pups, to protect fish stocks. The best way to protect the seas, sea life, and wild animals who are dependent on sea creatures for their sustenance is to stop eating fish. And that brings us to the summary. Factory farmed animals, whether cattle, chickens, pigs, turkeys, sheep, or ducks, are habitually deprived of fresh air, sunlight, mobility, their young, and the fulfillment of their most basic tendencies and urges. They are genetically manipulated, warehoused, and transported as if they were commodities, stock rather than sentient individuals. Animals exploited for their nursing milk, reproductive eggs, and flesh are routinely maintained, transported, and slaughtered in ways that maximize misery. Factory farms are designed and managed for profit. They are not conducive to the health, let alone happiness, of the individuals they exploit. Uninformed humans are now buying yet more fish and poultry, believing that such diet is healthful. Due to the smaller size of these individuals, this trend has exponentially increased the numbers of sentient and suffering animals who are exploited by food industries.
Consuming animals significantly increases our environmental footprint. It requires much more cleared land, consumes much more fresh water, and introduces many more pesticides, greenhouse gases, and animal waste into the environment than does a plant-based diet. Additionally, our taste for seafood has seriously depleted fish populations, simultaneously contributing to the starvation and disappearance of wild animals who depend on sea life for their sustenance. If we care about the earth, if we consider the earth sacred, we are obligated to stop consuming animal products, or at least to radically cut back on consumption of animal products, all animal products. We must not move to a vegetarian diet that increases consumption of dairy and eggs, or replace factory farmed flesh with fish, as both of these options exponentially enhance animal suffering and environmental degradation.
Understanding factory farming and fishing helps us to understand why our relationship with animals is spiritually important. Our dietary choices intimately affect the lives of other creatures and the earth itself. Whether or not we eat cattle, chickens, pigs, turkeys, sheep, ducks, salmon, cod, and shrimp is just one more daily expression of how we understand our place and responsibilities in the universe. So obviously that was a lot.
Yeah.
And for me, I think the scope of the problem is kind of the point. I don't know how often I've seen someone just lay it all out, just point after point after
Right.
point with all of the studies and statistics. And
Yeah, there are a lot of references in this appendix in the book throughout. But yeah, I mean, I feel like the appendix was definitely point by point. It is a lot. In some ways, it feels overwhelming. We didn't even cover all of it. But I think it's so massive and so overwhelming that you have to realize it has to hit you at some point that there's nothing good about animal agriculture.
yeah, it's unapologetically and powerfully written. We just felt like we just needed to give it its due.
Right.
The thing that I'm left with after reading through this appendix this time is the expendability of each life. Each individual life is really not worth considering in the rancher's mind, in the market's mind. They bake it into their cost model that
Right.
we know that thousands are going to die, and that's fine. The individual lives count for nothing,
Yeah.
which cannot align with our hearts. It can't align with us if we claim to be spiritual people who care about our religion. That just can't coexist.
Great. This book was an amazing book. And just reading about the core values in all the major religions, the similarities are eye-opening. And then to get, I love how she does it, right? She paints this beautiful, positive picture, and then she gives you this reality check at the end. And the two of those things together, it is a nice juxtaposition to the point when you're done. Yeah, you're just, hopefully it opens some eyes. And I feel like we cannot recommend this book enough.
Right.
Obviously, it is a commitment, but it's well worth it. Thank you, Dr. Kemmerer, for writing that amazing book. And again, every time I read it, or read parts of it, just even that appendix, you can see the work that she put into it.
Oh, my goodness.
Just can't imagine.
And thank you, listeners, for being here,
Yeah.
for listening.
Our next episode, we'll be interviewing Dr. Kemmerer. It's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
We both enjoyed that.
All right. Have a wonderful day.
Yeah, later.